Okay, so looks like we're going. Um, all right, guys, let me just make sure that I've got the, yep. Well, good afternoon, evening. I don't know what time you'll be watching this, but this is, obviously it's me, it's Dr. Bruce. It's September 9th, and we all know that 2020 is continuing to try to kill us here. So I hope you're safe. I hope that you and your families are safe in your homes. I know that that's probably not true for every Corbin family. So I know some have been displaced, and many have noted that even though they're not in immediate danger, that they have left their homes in various parts of Oregon right now. So I just know that we're saying general prayers for everybody, and we're kind of all responding to all these crises that continue to erupt around us. So my goal today, so this is, once you see this and listen to it, I just want you to be aware it's going to be between 50 and 60 minutes long, and the reason is simply this: because we've just had so many technical glitches, interruptions, getting used to the start of the semester, and we're just falling further and further behind. And so if I can get through about an hour of a presentation here on a Zoom video recording that you guys can access and watch from YouTube, this will just set us up really nicely for Friday. So I'm gonna try to get through and leave just a small segment about something called the floating world that I'm going to talk about on Friday for just a short time, and then we'll be able to have our discussion of Martin Scorsese's film Silence. So that's my goal. Again, my expectation, what we're being told is that, assuming the meteorologists, Forest Service guys, and all that they're having any accuracy with their reporting, the expectation is that the smoke danger levels will be reduced pretty significantly by Friday, and that we should hopefully be able to come to campus. So that's my hope. If something goes awry and we're still in this scenario, then obviously I'll send you a message, and I will prepare some recordings for Friday, and I'll figure out what to do with Silence. I don't know if I postpone a discussion until next week or not. We'll have to see, because we do have to move along. But we'll hopefully be together on Friday, either in person in the classroom if you're part of that group, or attending via the Zoom room and OWL. So a note on that: if I just want to make this simple for Friday, assuming we are back on campus to do the dual classroom thing, let's keep it as it was scheduled. So today would have been Group B. So that means back on Friday, it's back to Group A. So if you're in Group A and we are meeting on campus Friday, you're in the classroom, Group Bers, you would be Zooming in the Zoom room on Friday. And just for simplicity's sake, I just don't want to bat around and change a bunch of stuff right now. There's too much else going on. So that's kind of where we are. All right, so here's what I want to do. Gotta make sure I can see here. I want to dig into the Tokugawa system and both the feudal structure and some basic components of this system, again, which will set us up really nicely for Friday. If I'm really lucky, if this goes, smooth as silk, I might even get through the entire sequence by the end of this recording, but I want to keep my eye on the time. So I'll be watching that. But for the moment, let's just dig back into the feudal structure. And I want you to understand a couple of things that I just barely got into on Monday. So the emperor is a figurehead for the reasons I was talking about. It's primarily to protect the emperor in a sense, and preserve his status as this deified figure in Japanese culture. So the emperor does not descend to the level of other human beings and partake in all of the political drama and subterfuge that exists in that part of life. So the true cultural political authority, all the authority, falls to whoever is in the role of shogun. So the shogun is the commander in chief, as it were. He is the full monarch, right, in a sense. And you see it descends down from there. So I want you to understand some things. When we talk about samurai, it can get a little confusing because of the various divisions that take place. So from the shogun, you have these feudal lords, and this is something that's really interesting because feudal Japan, here we are, it's, you know, after the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, right? We talked about that briefly. So Tokugawa Ieyasu is the warlord who emerges victorious at Sekigahara. I'm going to come back to him and talk about how he sets up the new system and offers some adjustments that are really crucial as far as, you know, spinning out the new Tokugawa society that comes to the forefront. But, you know, after Sekigahara, here we are at 1600, and we're talking about a feudal system. And I know through the westernized mindset, that might seem a little bit nuts, to be honest with you, but it actually does make sense in a number of levels. So, by the way, the only good thing, as I think about it, probably the only good thing I can think of regarding doing this remote learning stuff again for hopefully this isolated day, but with recording these, it means that I'm at home, and it means that I don't have to wear a doggone mask. So that's always nice. I do really enjoy that. I get to actually come to you maskless. So I have to leave my, Batman cowl off screen, and you guys don't get to see my Batmobile and all that stuff. But, I think you'll live through that. So I actually really enjoy being able to sit here and just talk without a mask on. And of course, drink my coffee with my Snoopy Flying Ace mug, which I know some of you who had me in class last spring have already seen this fantastic mug that my son Connor bought for me. But I just love it. So Snoopy, the Flying Ace in particular, that's one of my favorite characters in the Peanuts comics. So you see how easy it is to get distracted when you're at home trying to put things together, but I'll get retracked here and focused. Okay, so Sekigahara, 1600, we're still talking about, in a very strange sense, we're still talking about a feudal system. So it descends, as you can see, through this social pyramid that I've got on the screen. We're dealing with a feudal structure that descends from the shogun on down. And so the daimyo, they function essentially like the European nobility did during the Middle Ages. Now, here's another catch. So the daimyo and the shogun himself was oftentimes promoted from, it was not uncommon anyway, I would say, for the shogun to have served at one point earlier in life as a samurai and then perhaps as a daimyo who ruled over a region and then ultimately gains the appointment as shogun. That happened a number of times in Japan's history prior to this point, all during what we know as the Ashikaga shogunate prior to Tokugawa. So the daimyo is this regional leader, okay? So the daimyo are appointed these fiefdoms throughout society, and they oversee rather large parcels of land and the socioeconomic structure, the politics within. They are also responsible for overseeing the warriors within that particular part of society, that parcel that they are assigned to. So they are overseeing quite a few samurai. Ronin, we're not going to talk about much today. Ronin are disenfranchised. So, you know, this slide doesn't communicate it well. But Ronin would have been considered at some level to be at least partially disgraced as warriors, and so they were no longer allowed to serve in the normal structure. They had to hire themselves out, which was considered less honorable. So I'll leave that there for the moment. Then you can see it descends on down. So you have 90% of the population, it says, are peasants, and the confusing thing about this is that 90% figure should probably include the artisans and merchants. I don't like the way they structured this slide. Maybe if we broke that down more accurately, it would be something like, you know, of the remaining portion of the Japanese population in the Tokugawa era, you would likely have, in the early Tokugawa, maybe about 60% or so peasants, and the remainder kind of distributed between artisans and merchants. It does shift over time so that the artisans and merchants are a higher percentage of the population. So by the mid-19th century, for instance, those percentages would have shifted somewhat. But I do think, I want you to take note of the fact that the peasants in the feudal structure, they are more respected in Japanese society than artisans and merchants were, so craftspeople and salespeople, which should say something. So those who are responsible for providing their fellow Japanese people with food, with sustenance, with those essential resources, they are valued more highly than those who are, you know, as this slide suggests, than those who are craftspeople, than those who are being creative with their skill sets, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly than someone who might be an entertainer, for instance, or whatever it may be. So very important class division. Bushido. So the code, that this is a term that you must know, there's no doubt, and the book, you know, the Holcomb text walks you through this pretty well. I don't think that I have to say a whole lot about Bushido because Holcomb covers it, but I just want to enunciate the primacy of this concept. So Bushido is so foundational to Japanese society of this era, of the century and a half primarily. Really for us, the focal point will be the 19th century, really. So throughout the vast majority of that century in Japan, Bushido was still highly central to Japanese life. And it's simply this concept of the way of the warrior. And it is honed around, it is defined around, much like a Greek concept like arete. So the pursuit of excellence. If you're in my Greece and Rome class, we've just gone through and we talked about arete. So sometimes in the West they say arete, but it's really arete. And the pursuit of excellence through the Greek concept is a very full-blooded, holistic approach. So it embodies what it means through a Greek mindset to be a virtuous human being. And virtue for the Greeks involves courage and honesty, and it involves an intense creative curiosity, always trying to become better for your own self, for your family that is around you, for your town, your polis, and for the betterment of fellow Greeks. There is a commitment, a very community-oriented concept here, where one is not just committed to oneself. This is not America. These are not American principles. Americans are not comfortable with the concept that everything isn't ultimately about them. individual liberty. We are brought up even through a cultural lexicon to buy into this framework of individuality being primary. And although I would, of course, regard individual worth as a very important concept, that is certainly true, we sometimes, in fact, we oftentimes in the United States in particular, we decide that that is far and away the most important part of life, to seek out and preserve our individual liberties. Those are concepts that would have been not only foreign, but probably viewed as dishonoring in Greek society and certainly in Japanese society of the Tokugawa period. So Bushido is very similar in its orientation. It is the way of the warrior, but of course what it really is trying to encapsulate is that in Tokugawa society, the warrior class is valued above all others. And the reason is this: the warrior class, typically, especially at the height of the Tokugawa system, circa 1650, 1700 or thereabouts, these warriors were given great honor by the rest in their society. They were given the time. They were not only dignified, they were given the time to devote their energies to their craft and to becoming the best examples of courage and virtue and honor and sacrifice in Japanese society. And so, although Bushido is, of course, most directly applied to the warrior, it would be wrong to assume that only the warriors valued it. It is a concept that many in Japanese society, even those outside of the warrior class, understood, and they understood the application of these virtues to better oneself in service to one's family and one's community and one's region, etc. In service to one another, in service ultimately to the shogun and to the emperor. This is an important concept. Now, of course, when we specifically apply this concept of Bushido to the samurai class, we dig into some important concepts. So hold on a second. We find the samurai. So I want to read you a component here. I'm going to have to look closely. I have a quote I want to read to you. This is a Japanese samurai. Actually, it's a daimyo, so someone who's describing the devotion of a samurai warrior. And this really brings out the notion of Bushido. So let me just read this to you. It is the duty of a warrior to be like a monk observing a rule. It is his business to preserve, I'm just going to read this closer. It is his business to preserve the state by protecting the sovereign. Whether he holds but a pin's point of land or rules 1,000 acres, his loyalty must be the same. He must not think of his life as his own, but as offered by him to his Lord. So it followed here that a vassal's life belonged to his Lord. A vassal could not, essentially decide to end his life of his own accord. Death is not a value in this system, really, but all roads seem to lead really in that direction. So here's the other part of the quote. A samurai must show the utmost courage in the face of death. So this is the continuation of this description of Bushido. Every morning, make up thy mind how to die. Every evening, freshen thy mind in the thought of death. Thus will thy mind be prepared. When thy mind is always set on death, thy way through life will always be straight and simple. So death was seen as better than disgrace and shame, as it would be better to die. We're going to talk about some other samurai codes as we get through some of this, but it's important to note how this system is structured from the very beginning, um, how we begin to understand, sorry, I have to put that over there, how we understand the mentality, the state of mind with the samurai. The samurai are servants. They are highly trained warriors. What I want you to understand as we move through the Tokugawa system and try to figure some of this out, they are certainly this is a state-sponsored, really, fighting force, right? So this is a state that has placed the highest value on the warrior. It is an East Asian equivalent of the Spartan society that oriented itself almost entirely around the practice of war. These warriors are certainly in service to both the emperor and the shogun in time of war against foreign entities. But let's be clear, the samurai also serve as this extension, this arm of the state as a policing force. So the samurai in each domain, overseen by the daimyo. Again, the daimyo are the nobility, these guys who are appointed these sectors. They answer specifically and formally to the shogun. And the samurai report to each daimyo, each respective daimyo, whoever is the daimyo for their region. So these samurai this is a warrior class that has been brought up, that is continually training, perfecting their skill sets, but they are certainly employed and used. Now, there is some irony, as we will get to. I will talk about the long eras of peace that come to the forefront during the Tokugawa era, because, hold on a second, because that also becomes important for us to understand. How do you have a warrior-based society that can function effectively, can function at nominal levels, when in fact the warriors go through these long periods of drought, so to speak, as far as being used? They're not fighting wars. Their policing is in many respects not overly necessary. And so you have this warrior elite who are not really using their skills. So I'll come back to that and talk about some of the implications of it. These warriors are, no, I grant you, this is a feudal system, and the armor that they wear, the weapons that they use might seem to be, out of touch with the modern world. But I can tell you, especially with the matchlock smoothbore weapons that the Europeans were using in the 17th century, and even with the flintlock smoothbores that were used on into the 18th century, those had some uses, but they had some severe limitations as well, not the least of which revolved around accuracy. And as American warriors, American government personnel, up to and including George Custer's 7th Cavalry in the 1870s, as they understood, if you are engaging an enemy force with highly trained warriors who have learned how to fight from youth and are highly skilled, you could encounter some pretty dire situations. And I will say that the samurai were indeed impressive warriors. Their time came and went, and certainly by the late 19th century, it was waning, and the candle was about to be extinguished as far as the samurai moment in history. But for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, these were some of the most highly skilled warriors. And the thing that I appreciate about the samurai that differentiates them from someone like, say, the Greek hoplites, right? So hoplites fight in formation most effectively. They are okay, they're decent warriors individually, but they are meant to fight in these groups, in the phalanx structure. When they are separated, when they are simply by themselves individually, their destructive capabilities are quite limited by comparison. Not so with the samurai. The samurai warriors could indeed, and often did, train to fight very effectively in groups and linear warfare, but they could also fight in smaller formations and certainly as individuals, very highly skilled individual warriors. I would match them up against just about anyone on the planet all the way through these eras of time. Skilled with bladed weapons, with bows, with arrows, with spears, and also highly skilled with their bare hands in the martial arts that they trained and practiced with. So this is a very unique skill set in this part of the world even. And I just want to make sure that we're aware of that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the daimyo. So again, back to the daimyo. This is a fascinating slide. So if you're watching this right now, of course, you're seeing this slide, and it's a depiction of the daimyo's, a very wealthy daimyo's fortress, a feudal lord and his subordinates that exist beneath his castle, and during the Ashikaga shogunate, which preceded the Tokugawa. I found this interesting because even this daimyo's dog appeared to have a suit of armor that it wore around. I would have enjoyed seeing that. I'm not sure the dog would have enjoyed wearing it very much, but it's nonetheless quite interesting. So the daimyo function as these feudal lords. And prior to the Tokugawa shogunate, one of the things that happens to destabilize Japan at this time, one of the things that happens is that the daimyo get into greater and greater competition with one another. And there's a great deal of inequity or inequality of socioeconomic capability. And so a lot of inequality as far as wealth dispersal existed. So there were daimyo who were appointed parcels of land that were just, had greater access to wealth and resources. So better land for farming. Perhaps they had access to a particularly resource-rich part of the ocean. You could fill in the blanks here, but the point is this: not all daimyo were able to live the same kinds of lifestyles. Some of them had far more wealth and power, and due to that wealth, they had far more wealth and power, and therefore they had they had these disagreements and battles and a lot of jealousy that certainly rose to the forefront. So the daimyo become a problematic part of Japanese society, and when Tokugawa comes to power, he tries to address this a little bit. So we've talked about Bushido. We've talked about these three guys: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. And the guy on the right, Tokugawa, is the warlord who wins out at Sekigahara and establishes this new shogunate. So the Tokugawa shogunate formally lasts from 1603 to 1868. There's a subsequent, sort of a civil war in Japan that involves, the warrior class and the emerging imperial class in Japan, and we'll see that as part of the Meiji Restoration. But throughout the Tokugawa era, there are some fascinating parts of this society that Tokugawa Ieyasu himself sets up beginning shortly after his success at the Battle of Sekigahara, and then his consolidation of power in the years following. And here's what happens. I want you to understand a couple of concepts. So the daimyo who were loyal to Tokugawa Ieyasu, who helped him, who joined and allied with him in overthrowing the other challengers, the other warlords and their armies. These were Fudai daimyo. That's the term that we associate with them. These were the Tokugawa loyalists. problem is this. Now, Tokugawa and the Fudai are able to throw off the others who are challengers, and they're shockingly, in some ways, they were able to win out here. However, a number of the defeated daimyo, the Tozama daimyo, who had been either formally allied with the challengers or had maybe ridden the fence a little bit during this whole era of reconstruction, as it were. So the Tozama daimyo, many of them were daimyo that oversaw the wealthier plots of land in Japan, and they had accumulated not only a lot of wealth but a good amount of influence and power. So when Tokugawa begins this new shogunate, how do you have a choice to make? And one possibility was you not only eliminate your challengers, the other warlords, you also round up every one of the Tozama daimyo that was loyal to those guys, and you kill them. If you do that, though, you run the very real risk of alienating yourself from the Japanese people, the peasants, the craftsmen, right, the artisans, the people that live in these regions overseen by the Tozama daimyo. So that might not be your best course of action. How far are you prepared to take the slaughter, maybe, is a question you would ask. Well, Tokugawa settles on a very interesting scenario, because he doesn't want to endanger. I mean, I'm sorry to say this isn't overly altruistic. It's not that Tokugawa likely cared a whole lot about the lives of the individual Tozama that had opposed him. It was more about trying to pave the way for, a good transitional process that allowed for his consolidation of authority and power, and wanted it to go smoothly and well, and to win over the loyalties of the people. So how do you do that? So here's what he does. He starts to reallocate the parcels of land. He starts to reallocate the territories of the daimyo who oversee those parcels of land. There will still inevitably be some parcels of land that are, in fact, more valuable, more sought after, with better farmland and all the rest that we talked about. But there is an attempt to try to balance it out a little bit, to balance that ledger out, so that there's at least a little more of comparable equity in the parcels of land distributed around Japan. And these are described through the kikos of rice. So that designation is basically like 5 bushels of rice as a kiko of rice. So that's the way the system is valued, how you would define that value. So here's what Tokugawa does. He brings the Fudai daimyo, many of whom had been kind of on the fringes of Japanese society as far as wealth was concerned. He brings them closer to Edo, which is where the where the shogun lives, and he parcels out the more valuable sectors of land to his most capable Fudai daimyo, who had helped him the most and had been the most successful warriors in battle, and had overseen samurai who were clearly the more loyal ones to him. And he sends the formerly wealthy and powerful Tozama daimyo out to the fringes of Japan. So let me come to a slide here. So you'll notice, by the way, Edo, maybe I do have I might have a map that would be a little helpful here, but all right. So Tokyo is, it's not exactly the same, but Tokyo is essentially where Edo is located. much of modern Tokyo is so expansive, it's not really a great comparison anymore. But generally, pretty close. So Tokugawa would send these Tozama daimyo out to the fringe locations. So out here, to regions like Shikoku and Kyushu, the southern island, and some of the outliers in the north as well. Territories that were, first and foremost, many of them had smaller parcels of land and relatively limited resources, but more importantly, they were geographically distant from Edo, meaning that these daimyo, if they really got angry, they would have to enlist a bunch of people and make a rather long trek toward Edo to challenge Tokugawa's authority. So he's weakening the power of the Tozama daimyo. He's at least bringing many of the Fudai daimyo into the picture here as participants in this process in a more powerful way. And he's actually elevating some of the more respected Fudai daimyo to some very high positions of respect indeed during Tokugawa, the early Tokugawa era. So that's all important for you to understand. There's also a really interesting component. So how do you maintain some sense of authority? There are a lot of things that the Holcomb text begins to walk you through. I think the one that really stands out to me that's most fascinating, if you will, is this notion of alternate attendance. So under Tokugawa, he makes a number of interesting adjustments. And this one really strikes me. The alternate attendance mandate was that every couple of years, every single daimyo had to spend at least 6 months, perhaps even a year, with the shogun in Edo, housed by the shogun in his, on the palace grounds on the shogunate grounds, right, where the shogun lived there for months at a time with their families, and pledge loyalty, get to know one another better, kind of give the shogun a sense of who his most reliable daimyo were throughout the entire country. And so there was this rotation of daimyo who would come and stay at the shogun's fortress, at the shogun's stronghold in Edo. And here's the interesting part. When that visitation time was done, the daimyo would leave and return to his particular province, but his family would remain behind in the shogun's fortress until an agreed upon time when the shogun would allow the daimyo to retrieve their family and have them come back. In a sense, it was like basically the daimyo's family, when they left and went back to their province, their families were sort of held hostage by the shogun until such time as the shogun could be convinced that this daimyo was not going to start any rough stuff or cause any sort of rebellion or anything of that kind. And if they did, well, then they had your family. Very kind of a creepy policy, as you can imagine, but also a shockingly effective one during these years of the Tokugawa shogunate. Fascinating. Okay. Oh, yes, the levels of samurai. So again, with the samurai, something you have to understand, there were like subdivisions within the warrior class system. So as you can imagine, like with the daimyo, not every samurai was able to live the same kind of life. So there were some samurai who came from more respected families, samurai who fought in campaigns and battles, who who kind of made a name for themselves. They dignified themselves in battle and received greater favor in that sense. There were kind of, you get the idea. There were up and comers. There were those who had kind of risen through the ranks and gotten a lot of attention, and they were given by their daimyo. They were given more responsibility, and oftentimes certain samurai were given, greater access to wealth and privilege than some of the other samurai. It was possible, even though in Japanese society, it was possible to be a samurai, especially by the time we get to the mid-19th century. It was possible to be a samurai, but to have not fought in a single campaign or battle, and therefore to not have made a name for oneself, and to have not accumulated greater wealth and power and privilege, and to really be barely able to make a living. We will see that when we get to the mid-19th century. We'll come back to this and talk about it some more. But I wanted to mention that now because I think it's a crucial component to understand. Okay. Let's see. I want to make sure, that I talk about a few things. Oh, yes, the shushigaku. Oh, this is another critical component. So when we think about the associations for ethics and virtue in Japanese culture, this term is a crucial one to understand. So I'm gonna read a component that I think will help us here with applying this notion of shushigaku. Righty, and of course the page that I had this open to flipped to a different one, and it's not where I wanted it to be. So just give me a second and I'll find it for you. So the shushigaku is a widely used term. Hold on a second. Da, da, da. Okay, here we go. There we go. So shushigaku. So the Tokugawa shogunate made what we call Neo-Confucianism, and the Japanese term for Neo-Confucianism is shushigaku. They make this basically the state ideology, which obviously, as we've talked about before, if you're using Confucianism, we are talking about a system of ethics that is applied into various sectors of society. It had been set forth in China's Song dynasty and had erupted from there. So in Tokugawa Japan, the regime's main interest in this philosophy was its social ethic, particularly its stress on subordination. So filial piety, as we've talked about before, this comes to the forefront quite a bit. So here's what it's a translation of a Japanese daimyo from the late 18th century who writes about the applications of shushigaku. And he says this: these values that we hold dear fit well and reinforce the ethical elements in Bushido. So right there, just an easy application, the whole concept of the way of the warrior, the pursuit of excellence through the mind of this warrior class, and valuing those pursuits, all the virtues, right? They combine very neatly, as you might see, with Confucianism or Neo-Confucianism in this case. So he says these fit well. The goal is to stress the values of our societal order, the purpose that motivates the Tokugawa to set up its state structures. So this daimyo is being a little political here, but we'll give him a little room to maneuver. So we see that the schools, now I'm not going to dig into all of them for you here. Holcomb walks you through a bit of this. There are different schools of Confucian thought in Japan. There's not one monolithic shushigaku, Neo-Confucian structure in place, as it were. So there are some different approaches to how to take Neo-Confucianism and apply it in every single instance. But the idea here is that by applying Neo-Confucianism to these basic societal structures, so the daimyo and their relationship to the samurai, senior veteran samurai and their relationship with up-and-coming newer samurai. So if we go up the chain of command, daimyo to shogun, and technically shogun to emperor, these all, the filial piety element is in play across the board. And the loyalty to each successive superior is very crucial here. And it's not just a haphazard one, it is a binding one. So especially in the case of viewing Bushido and Shushigaku as brethren components, as philosophical brethren, as it were, this is really important to note. It just kind of adds this additional layer to this commitment to those who you answered to in Japanese society. And that's really critical to understand. Now, there are other applications of Shushigaku. I mean, they're, in towns and villages across the country. But for the moment, I think this concentration point for us is really good with the warrior class and the levels of political power that we've been talking about. So the Neo-Confucian applications are actually really, really important with this concept of Shushigaku. Okay, I have, by my count, about 4.5, almost 5 minutes left before I wanted to cut this off. So I was secretly hoping this is where I would be. But here's what I want you to understand. There is this added component to Japanese culture that begins to emerge really during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Now, the emergence is not really initially a problem at all, but it's the prominence of what becomes referenced as the floating world that does become an issue. So, what is the floating world? The floating world is this enticing part of Japanese culture that begins to intrude upon these highly defined and presumably virtuous preferences in Japanese society. Particularly, the floating world exists as, kind of a retinue of entertaining sources for the Japanese in power. Particularly, of course, these are temptations for the warrior class that begin to emerge. Places for them to go and spend whatever money they have accumulated. So, geisha houses, right? Chains of prostitution, gambling, things that are less offensive than those elements. So even the emergence of entertainers, so dramas, all sorts of dramatic presentations. You have troops that would, as they did in much of the world, troops that would travel around Japan and perform for the different villages in each region. And these kinds of things began to emerge and become more and more popular. And here's what happened. So this is my reference point back to something that I said earlier, and it is basically this. The prostitution houses, the gambling houses, the entertainment factories, as it were, these all became so enticing. The Japanese warrior class, which in the early 19th century had comparatively little to worry about and oversee. There were not constant wars being fought. They were not required. Their policing services, as it were, policing is not it's not a synonym here. I'm offering you some sort of a comparison. they weren't police officers. It's not the same exact thing, but because they are functioning for state security and overseeing that, I'm using that term. The end result here is this, that the samurai class in particular becomes deeply absorbed into the increasing forms of entertainment that begin to emerge. And they are not only spending their money, they are spending greater amounts of time and energy in what is referred to as the floating world. And that includes, by the way, all sorts of access to various forms of alcohol. Sake would be probably the most famous of these, but it's not just sake, it's other things that the warriors are partaking in. And this screen, you know, one of the slides in the screen, you've got the skeleton there in the lower right-hand corner. The Japanese warriors were preyed upon, in a sense. And this is considered to be a surrendering of their moral virtue. The more and more time they spend partaking in these activities, the less time they are spending in the preparation for what they are supposed to be doing, the virtuous life that they are ostensibly leading, they're supposed to be leading. And so the floating world, the world of the geishas and the gambling houses and, you know, the equivalent of the bar scene, right? These are depriving the warrior class of their very souls, in a sense. And especially as Japan becomes drawn into some international issues by the mid to late 19th century, we're going to see that the transition from a much more traditional feudal society has a dramatic effect on Japan in these ways. And it may begin with the floating world, but that is expanded into, you know, the market principles of Western style capitalism and modernized militaries and all the rest. And the floating world is one of the first intrusions, really, even though it's an internally constructed intrusion, it is still a major issue for the Japanese world of the Tokugawa. Okay, guys and gals, I'm going to end there. We will hopefully see each other on Friday. I will see Group A in the classroom on Friday is my distinct hope. The Group B'ers will be Zooming in with us on Friday. Again, that is my hope. If that changes, I will obviously let you guys know. We'll hope and pray that the smoke situation in Salem improves, and we will certainly hope and pray that the fires are contained and ultimately extinguished, and that particular danger is hopefully going to subside. I sure hope so. I know there's already been a lot of destruction, but miss seeing you guys. It'll be hopefully just a couple of short days, and then we'll be back together. But regardless, you know, stay safe and stay smart, and we'll connect soon, okay? All right, take care.